Matriarchal swordtail. Even on the last day of her life, she was pecking at some unfortunate female, watching her scuttle for refuge before turning with an air of satisfaction, flashing me that look of inimitable triumph, for her fins leisurely fanning the water, spreading live signals of her authority. But as the day wore on, there was a faraway look in her eyes. By evening, her lips froze and hardened, and next morning I found her sitting squat on the tank floor, so still, so regal, so fiercely alive. It was difficult to tell that she was dead. As her physical abilities wore out, there could have been experienced some intrinsic nerve-wrenching pain, but throughout it all, the matriarchal swordtail showed no sign. She would not embarrass herself to suffer, nor writhe with humiliation at some internal disorder. And mercifully, perhaps, night was the only witness. Even in death, she retained her rich coloring with all her gills and fins intact, and so finely arranged and laid they defied any fish to draw close to salvage at her remains. As if they dared. Until she was removed, she continued to arrest the eye, a splendid, even sculpture of burnished orange, capable of holding all in, with this nerve-tingling sparkle of steel pins. Okay. I'm going to also read a bit from my essay, Matriarchal, also titled Matriarchal Swordtail, which is the bit beginning page 350. I heard about Miss Ho's death on 13th March 2018. To share the news, I posted shots of her poor matriarchal swordtail, describing an imperious, brilliantly colored bully of a tropical fish, suddenly discovered lifeless on the floor of her aquarium. Later, at the funeral, her family expressed her surprise that I'd used this poem. It had been written about a distant ancestress, they said, bearing no resemblance to the kindly maiden aunt they'd known. I stand by my choice. Miss Ho really was a bit of a manic mother to us students, less interested in inspiration than in scolding and worrying, waxing nostalgic about her NUS past under Dr. Arthur Yap, paying scant attention to the world-changing events around her. Once she casually remarks that she'd stopped following music after the Bee Gees. Another time, she assumed a poetic reference to Flight MI-185 was random alphanumerics. Many will mention her eccentric habit of referring to herself, not with first-person pronouns, but by name. But what I recall more vividly, as her chosen favorite, are her interminable phone calls, hogging the landline for up to an hour while I itch to complete my Maths C tutorials and do my History 7 readings. Now, I wasn't a victim. I embarked on little rebellions. I'd leave the receiver hanging in the middle of conversations and blame it on the connection when she noticed. When we held Artist Jam, our annual showcase of multidisciplinary art collectives, I named all the groups after breakfast condiments, kaya, marmalade, peanut butter, and used the presentation as an excuse to climb on top of a television cabinet and devour a carnation. After my seniors held a haiku workshop, I counted with a limerick workshop. And when I was invited back to the Afternoon of Poetry and Music in 1999 as a tonsured army boy, I shook up the stage lecture theatre with a loud poem, still the best known of my spoken word pieces. But to what extent were these rebellions unforeseen? And how unwelcome? To be sure, Miss Ho played the conservative fuddy-duddy, but she was the one who had chosen to groom me as an overdramatic, angsty, barely closeted kid poet, chafing against the heteronormativity of his ACS uniform, picking me out of a sea of creative arts program wannabes, featuring me at the Afternoon of Poetry and Music from the age of 15, publishing me in Tributaries, even before installing me in her club. And in 1997, she actually invited the Guyanese-British poet Grace Nichols to deliver a workshop, teaching us about performance poetry, 5 years before Chris Mooney Singh started hosting his Singapore slams. I wouldn't say she endorsed our insubordinations. Miss Ho is vexed, she'd complain. But the point is that she tolerated us, made space for us, and understood that with creativity comes mischief. some of us would return that favor of patience. I recall a 2016 channel at the Arts House Chamber, Singlet 101, Season 3, Poetry and Existence, hosted by Gui Li Sui, pairing her off with her old student, Alfian Saad, as fellow poets of the 90s. She spent the hour defending the PAP's illiberal policies, lecturing us on racial politics, proclaiming a binary distinction between the survivalist culture of the Chinese and the lion ties of the Malays, and insisting that racial discrimination wasn't a thing in Singapore. And what did Alfian do? The activist, the firebrand, the enfant terrible. He kept to his seat, gently explaining his counter-perspective, even as she talked over him, even as the audience muttered about this white-haired no-name daring to eclipse the famed playwright they'd come to see. Now, I had no such patience. I sat in my seat squirming at the microaggressions, prepping to post them on social media. When the session broke, I saw Jennifer Ann Champion was there too, hoping to get an archival recording for poetry.sg, but unwilling to interrupt Miss Ho as she chatted with old students, reliving old memories. So I cashed in my credit as her old favorite. I marched up to my teacher and ordered her to get in a corner for the recordings so future generations might get to hear her voice. Now, I'm not proud of this. By then, by almost all metrics, I outranked her in the literary scene. I was a more recognizable name. I'd published and edited more books. This on top of the privileges I already enjoyed from my gender and relative youth. I wasn't a little fish fighting back. I had become the bully. And yet, for my generation, at least, there's still something indelible about the teacher-student relationship that makes 2 brief years in uniform so much more than any future metamorphoses of status and power. Once a matriarchal swordtail, always a matriarchal swordtail.